Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me where you are watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I still remember that late autumn evening, the kind where the air outside feels crisp enough to make you appreciate the warmth inside your own home. I was in my kitchen, letting a pot of soup simmer slowly on the stove while the sound of gentle rain tapped against the windows. I wasn't expecting anyone, and honestly, I was enjoying the quiet after a long week. But then I heard a soft knock at the door, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. When I opened it, there he was. My nephew Daniel, standing on the porch with his shoulders slightly hunched and his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. He looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. His eyes met mine for a second, and then he quickly looked away, almost as if he wasn't sure he should be there. Something about his expression made my heart stir. I asked if everything was all right, but he just gave a small shrug and asked if he could come in for a minute. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something he was fighting to keep steady. I stepped aside and let him in, watching as he brushed a bit of rain off his shoulders and stayed near the door like he wasn't sure he deserved to be farther inside. I told him he could sit wherever he liked, but he stayed standing for a while, almost pacing, then stopping, then starting again. Eventually he settled at the edge of the couch, still looking like he might get up at any moment. I sat down across from him and waited. I've learned that silence sometimes speaks louder than questions. His foot kept tapping the floor, and every few seconds his fingers would brush against each other like he was trying to settle himself. When he finally exhaled, it felt like the whole room did too. He glanced at me, his voice barely above a whisper when he admitted he'd been carrying something heavy with him for a while. Something he didn't know how to talk about, something he didn't feel comfortable sharing with anyone else. I didn't interrupt, even though a dozen worried thoughts crossed my mind. I wanted to give him space. He's always been the kind to hold things in until they almost crushed him. He ran a hand through his hair and told me that he came because he trusted me more than anyone. That simple sentence, spoken with so much sincerity, made my chest warm. I wasn't sure where the conversation was heading, but the way he looked at me, steady but unsure, told me it was important. The house felt unusually quiet. Even the rain seemed to pause. And in that stillness, I felt the weight of something shifting between us, not in a dramatic or frightening way, but in a deeply human way. Like he was standing on the edge of saying something that mattered, and I was the only person he trusted to hear it without judgment. I leaned forward, letting him know he had all the time he needed, and that I was right there with him. That small reassurance seemed to settle him just slightly, but the nervous energy was still there, pulsing gently beneath every word he hadn't yet spoken. He took one more slow breath, and I could tell he was finally ready to tell me why he'd come. And even though I didn't know what was coming, I could already feel the start of a moment that would stay with me for a very long time. The moment Daniel finally looked me in the eyes, really looked, I felt something inside him shift. His shoulders loosened just a little, like he'd found the courage he'd been searching for all evening. The rain outside had grown steadier, creating a soft rhythm that filled the room and made everything feel more intimate, more focused. I waited quietly, letting him gather his thoughts. I didn't want to rush him. I've always believed people open up when they feel safe, not pressured. He started slowly, his voice uneven at first, saying he didn't know who else to talk to. Life, he admitted, hadn't felt like it was moving in the direction he expected. He'd been struggling with responsibilities, expectations, and decisions that didn't quite fit who he felt he was becoming. He paused, taking in a shaky breath as he stared down at his hands, which were now clasped tightly together. I could tell he had been carrying this weight by himself for far too long. He explained how he'd been feeling alone, even when surrounded by friends, and how that loneliness had started to make him second-guess every choice he made. He said he came to me because I'd always been the person who listened without judgment, the person who understood him in ways others didn't. Hearing that made something inside me soften. It was humbling and deeply touching to know that he saw me as that kind of anchor in his life. I moved a bit closer, not too close, but enough that he could feel my presence. I told him that everyone reaches moments where life feels heavier than it should be, and that those moments don't define us. They guide us, teach us. His eyes lifted slightly, meeting mine with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. I kept my voice gentle as I reminded him that seeking clarity isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of growth, of wanting to move forward with intention rather than fear. As I spoke, I noticed the tension slowly easing out of his posture. His breathing steadied, his voice becoming clearer. He admitted that he'd been afraid of disappointing the people around him, his parents, his friends, even me. That confession lingered in the air, tender and honest. I assured him that he hadn't disappointed me. On the contrary, the fact that he came to talk, to open up, showed courage that not everyone has. He leaned back slightly, as if the room felt safer now. The rain tapping against the windows became softer, almost calming, and I realized how grateful I was that he had come that evening. Sometimes the most unexpected conversations become the ones that bring people closer in ways they couldn't have predicted. He continued sharing moments he hadn't told anyone else, missteps he regretted, hopes he had quietly buried, and choices he wasn't sure how to face. I listened, truly listened, watching his face as the emotions passed through him. I didn't interrupt unless he paused long enough to look overwhelmed, and even then, it was only to offer a few reassuring words. My presence seemed to give him space to breathe again. By the time he finished, he looked lighter, as though speaking the truth aloud had lifted something heavy off his chest. He rubbed his palms together softly and exhaled in a way that felt final, like he finally said the thing he came to say. I reached out, lightly resting my hand near his, not touching, just close enough to let him know I understood him, that his trust meant something real. He offered a small, grateful smile, one of those smiles that doesn't fully form but says everything. And in that quiet moment between us, I realized this wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of a turning point for him, and maybe, in its own way, for me too. Daniel sat quietly for a few moments after finishing his confession, and I could tell he was still sorting through the emotions he had just let out. The room felt warm, not just from the soup simmering in the kitchen, but from the sense of honesty that now filled the space. I watched him breathe a little easier, his posture no longer so tight and guarded. It reminded me of how he used to look after finally telling the truth about something as a child, relieved, vulnerable, but somehow stronger. I asked if he wanted some tea, partly to give him a moment to settle, partly to give myself a chance to take in everything he had just shared. He nodded, and I walked into the kitchen, letting the familiar motions soothe me. Boiling water, choosing a cup he used to love when he was younger, adding a little honey before I even asked, simple things that felt grounding. When I returned to the living room, he was sitting more comfortably, elbows resting on his knees, eyes wandering around the room, as if seeing it differently. I handed him the tea, and he thanked me with a quiet voice that carried more gratitude than the words themselves. He took a small sip, then exhaled softly. "I didn't expect to say all of that," he admitted, almost embarrassed. I told him I understood. Sometimes words slip out when the heart finally finds a place that feels safe. His eyes softened at that, and for a moment I saw the boy he once was, the one who had always looked to me for reassurance. He leaned back, rubbing his thumb along the side of his cup. "I kept thinking if I talked about it, it would make everything real," he said, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I nodded, telling him that speaking the truth doesn't make life harder, it makes it clearer. He tilted his head slightly, considering that, and I could see the idea settling into him gently. The conversation naturally shifted to the choices ahead of him. He asked what I would do if I were in his shoes, not in a way that transferred responsibility, but in a way that showed he trusted my perspective. I didn't give him direct answers. Life rarely works that way. But I offered him thoughts he could build on. I spoke about patience, about giving himself the grace to change directions without guilt, and about the courage it takes to choose a path that feels right rather than expected. While he listened, his expression changed in subtle ways. His eyes steadied, his breathing grew deeper, and even the lines around his mouth softened. It was like watching someone step out of a shadow they hadn't realized they were standing in. He started asking more questions, thoughtful ones, the kind that show he was no longer overwhelmed, but curious about possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. At one point, he paused and mentioned that he didn't know how he had drifted so far from himself. That comment made my chest tighten a little. I told him most people don't realize they're drifting until something wakes them up. Sometimes a failure, sometimes a conversation, sometimes simply a moment of honesty. He looked at me with a quiet understanding, and for the first time that evening, I saw confidence beginning to return to him. The atmosphere in the room changed slowly, becoming calmer, more open. Daniel sat back fully, no longer perched on the edge of the couch. His hands rested lightly on his cup instead of gripping it. When he spoke now, his voice had a steadier rhythm. It was remarkable, really, how much someone could change in a single evening when they finally allowed themselves to speak freely. He thanked me again in a way that felt deeper than before. Not just for listening, but for being someone he could come to at all. Hearing that made me feel something warm settle in my heart. I told him he wasn't alone, and he never had been. Something in his expression softened even more, and he breathed out slowly, as if letting go of the last piece of tension he'd been holding on to. There was still more he wanted to say. I could sense it by the way he looked at the floor, gathering the right words. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the kind of pause you take before sharing something important, something carefully held. I waited, knowing whatever he was about to tell me next would reveal even more of what he'd truly come here to say. Daniel's pause stretched gently between us, not heavy or uncertain, but thoughtful, like he was choosing the right doorway to step through. I stayed quiet, letting the moment unfold at its own pace. The rain outside had softened to a slow drizzle, and the living room felt wrapped in a calm stillness. When he finally lifted his eyes, there was a steadiness in them that hadn't been there earlier, a quiet resolve that told me he had reached a turning point. He set his cup down carefully on the table and sat back, drawing in a slow breath before speaking. "There's one more thing," he said, and his voice carried a clarity I hadn't heard from him all night. He told me that the real reason he came wasn't just to unburden himself, but because he needed someone who could help him understand his own thoughts without judgment. He said he'd been looking for guidance, not answers, but reassurance that choosing a new path wouldn't make him a failure. The sincerity in his tone made my chest warm. I told him that change doesn't make anyone weaker. It simply proves they're paying attention to their own life. I reminded him that fear often disguises itself as caution, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is trust themselves enough to begin again. He listened with a quiet intensity, nodding slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee, as if absorbing each word. He admitted that he'd been afraid others would think he was giving up, especially the people closest to him. But then he looked at me, really looked, and said that tonight had helped him realize he'd been measuring himself by pressures that weren't even his. Hearing that made me smile softly. Growth often comes in moments exactly like this, quiet, unexpected, but deeply transformative. I moved a little closer so he wouldn't feel like he was speaking into a distance. I told him that his life didn't need to mirror anyone else's expectations, that he had every right to choose the path that made sense to him, even if it meant starting fresh. His shoulders eased again, and he exhaled in a way that felt final, like something had clicked firmly into place. There was a peaceful silence then, broken only by the gentle hum of the stove in the kitchen and the softened rain. Daniel's expression was different, more grounded, more assured. He said he hadn't realized how much clarity could come from just talking to someone who cared. I told him that sometimes that's all any of us need. Someone who listens, really listens, with the intention of understanding rather than fixing. He gave a small, grateful smile, the kind that held both relief and appreciation. He thanked me not just for the evening, but for being someone he could return to when life felt heavy. And I felt a quiet gratitude of my own, knowing that our conversation had opened a door for him he hadn't known how to find on his own. Eventually, he stood up, stretching slightly, and walked toward the door with a steadier step than when he had arrived. I followed him to the entryway, and when he turned back, the nervousness from earlier was gone, replaced by a gentle confidence that made him look almost younger. He said he felt lighter, as if he'd finally put words to things he'd been carrying silently for too long. Before stepping out, he paused and said, "I'm really glad I came tonight." I told him I was glad too, more than he realized. As he walked out into the cool evening air, the rain had eased to a soft mist, and the quiet street felt peaceful. I'd watched him go, knowing he would navigate the next steps of his life with more clarity than he had when he first knocked on my door. When I closed the door behind him, the house felt warm and calm, the kind of quiet that settles in after something meaningful has taken place. I stood there for a moment, letting the memory sink in. It was a night that reminded me how powerful a simple conversation can be, how connection, trust, and honesty can change the direction of a person's life. And long after the sound of his footsteps faded, I stayed in that moment, grateful for the bond we shared and for the unexpected evening that had brought us closer than either of us expected.